Oliver, welcome back to the podcast. It's been it's probably been maybe 3, 4 years since your last appearance.
Oh wow, is it? I'm honored for you to have me back. Obviously, must be something. I must be saying something decent from time to time.
Yeah, so I mean, last time we talked about long COVID and your sort of recovery there that took us into things like five rhythms. And I feel that today maybe we're going a little bit deeper and what you said off air, the intersection between relationships, trauma, and illness, I think sums it up incredibly well.
Hmm.
So, with that sort of topic laid, how would you like to start? I'm just going to sort of throw the ball into your court, really.
Sure. Um, I think I want to talk about stuff that's felt in the body, but remind me to come back to that, right? About
Okay.
how I felt at the start of this session, let's say. But the thing that I think that's sort of really live for me at the moment for coming into it, I haven't sort of done tons of prep, which I think is okay, you know. Well, you and I are normally quite dynamic in the moment with this stuff. So um, the thing that was on my mind coming into it was that the sort of the dichotomy of um, attachment versus authenticity. And if you think that what we tend to do is we sacrifice authenticity for attachment, regardless of how good or not good that attachment is, whether it's toxic or poisonous or whatever it may be, right? Because as a child, and this is all about sort of early life nurture, care, you know, because what we need as children is nurture, care, and attunement, right? And what often happens is that we sacrifice ourselves as a child if our parent isn't behaving in the way we want it to. We then sacrifice our authenticity in our approaches with that parent in order not to lose that parent, because if we lose that parent in that moment, it's like, shit, I'm not going to survive here, and I'm gonna be abandoned. Yeah. And I think the reason I mention this off at first is that's your sort of primal instinct as a child. And what I see so much in the patients I work with is that they've sacrificed that authenticity. Um, I don't know if you introduced me very kindly to Dr. Judith Mazel's work, and she came to one of our team meetings, you know, and she talks about chronic fatigue and about neurosomatic illness. I've got a slide of hers that she very kindly let me reuse. Is it worth sharing that here, or is it only really an audio type thing? This?
No, you can absolutely share it.
Yeah, okay. I might just bring that up then if I can find it for you. Hold on, if it allows me to. Oh, there we go. And you'll remember this probably anyway. So let me just. Oh, can you see that?
Yeah.
So 6-stage life cycle of chronic neurosomatic illness, and yeah, I mean, it's very self-explanatory, but I think where a child has that insecure attachment, there is, and then what Judith says is there is, where is it? Yeah, the silencing of the true self, which is basically around authenticity, right?
Mm.
Um, and then as a result of that, when we go into relationships, whether that's with often our significant other, right, or even just relationships and friends in our lifetime, there's no depth or authenticity because we're often frightened of losing that friend or that relationship or what have you. Yeah. And then obviously she talks about all of this occurring, and then that's what then leads into basically an unresolved stress response, and then the beginnings of what she calls obviously neurosomatic illness, which again is basically chronic fatigue is often rooted in a lot of this. I use an actual worded slide, which is this one here, which if you look at when patients come to see us in clinic, they come to us with symptoms, or any clinician sees symptoms, but your average clinician, whether, you know, in conventional medicine, is just treating the symptoms, and it's an acute care model, right? And even most integrated practitioners are still stuck in this area here, which is the biochemistry and the physiology, right? But what people are not really realizing is that what happens in early life, a lot of that is inherited via epigenetic transmission, via inherited trauma. And then what happens, there's an element of developmental trauma for patients. We have this sort of story or narrative we tell ourselves that then changes the autonomic and the central and the parasympathetic nervous system. That then changes obviously our physiology, but then what tends to happen, there's some increase in allostatic load that occurs to a patient later on in their life. And it can be, what I see a lot of is, like burnout, workaholism, loss of a loved one, breakdown in a marriage, loss of a parent, some form of abuse or major trauma. And then then everything just falls apart. It's like the tipping point, or yeah. And then obviously Robert Naviaux has very cleverly called it the cell danger response, which I sort of overly simplify and call it the freeze state. The body's in this sort of freeze state. It can't recognize friend from foe. People get fancy diagnoses like mast cell activation disorder. The gut doesn't work properly. But all these fancy diagnoses really, not many, there's more awareness of it now. People like Gabor Mate and people like that, and Bessel van der Kolk and stuff. But this stuff here is just generally ignored, right? And my experience shows me that if you don't deal with this stuff, and if you're not curious about this, then the symptoms you're experiencing are not really going to get better. They'll get better to a degree. And in a few cases, you might get lucky and get someone 90% or 100% better. But often some other increase in allostatic load will happen in the patient's life, and then they'll be back here again because they haven't dealt with this. Yeah. So if I just give you that sort of share those couple of slides just for the audience, just to give them a sort of a visual sort of cue of what I'm getting at. And I think that this idea of relationships, trauma, illness, obviously the first relationship we have in our life is with, our caregivers, right? And I don't think anyone has the perfect parents, right? But most people get that sort of, it's like quoting Gabor Mate, which is, he often says, did you have someone you could go to when you were a child, when you were upset and something wasn't right for you? Was there someone you could go to? And he calls that trauma of a small t. And if you didn't, well, that's not great, right? So if you didn't have someone, there is that silencing of the authentic self. It's a bit like, that there was that period where, I know some people still do it, the controlled crying with kids, with babies, at night when they cry out. And that's the very first often experience a child gets of there's no one there. And eventually after a few nights, the child stops crying because it realizes that there's no one there. And there is that silencing, there's the freeze state. And some people are still championing that, control crying of kids to give the parents a better night's sleep, or only feeding the child when when on the parent schedule. But really children should be fed on demand, right? So I think that it does start very early on in life. And I know that obviously at the clinic I run, we do a lot with complex illness. Some of your audience, won't be as compromised as some of the patients that we see at the clinic. Notwithstanding that, I don't know what you think, but I think it's almost impossible to have a digestive problem. If we're talking, obviously Healthpath does a lot of microbiome testing, what have you. I think it's impossible to have a digestive problem without a nervous system component. That's my contention. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I would say that the vast majority of times that's true. I think just thinking about the physiology of the gut and how it's regulated, innervated, we know that the nervous system sort of is at the top of the tree, so to speak. So yeah, I would agree to a large extent there. And I think just to reiterate some of what you've said there, obviously it's really easy to find research on sort of adverse childhood events and allostatic loads and the relationship to disease in adulthood. But what you've already touched on is, I guess, some of the other ways that we get impacted, which is more social, relational, and things like this as well. It's not just a physiological impact, but the way we're actually relating to the world at large and experiencing it are altered. So it becomes a really vicious cycle of all these things being interconnected.
Yeah, most people don't explore this stuff, and it's for understandable reasons. Either A, not aware of it, or B, touching this stuff is very painful. It's like, where Rumi said the wound is where the light comes in, and I had a session with my own therapist this week who I've done couples therapy and individual therapy with for a long time. And, she said, look, she was talking about marriages and saying that, 99% of marriages, you can be like 99% of those marriages, or you can be like the 1% where there is real depth. But to get to that depth, there's a lot of uncovering of old stuff and old wounds. And it's like we repeat the same patterns from one relationship to another. And often we go to what's familiar. It's a bit cliche to say, yes, we marry our fathers or we married our mothers. It's not always the case, but we will go to behavior patterns that are familiar from childhood. And often that's down to our self-worth or lack of self-worth. And I see a massive amount in patients. I find that a lot of the time the patients come to the clinic and they want to focus on, when they see an integrated practitioner such as you and I, they want to work on their diet and supplementation and herbal medicine. And they're very focused on that. But as you know, I use like IFS in my practice, internal family systems, which I recommend your audience. I think that most psychotherapy, in my experience, is often can be a waste of time. And I think because it's very heady, and it's like using the thief to catch the policeman. And stuff generally has to be moved through the body and related to within the body from a sort of a somatic way. And techniques such as somatic experiencing or IFS or compassionate inquiry, I find are much better ways of doing that for people, and having much better results than more traditional, talking-based forms of psychotherapy. And I think that what patients want to do is something they can control a lot of the time rather than going to the deeper places. And what I try to do is move them back to touching the pain, touching the old wounds. And I think sometimes when I'm using IFS techniques for patients, the very symptoms they're coming to the clinic with, when we go and look for it in the body, is often exactly the same thing. When we get them to feel that within the session, is exactly what they're feeling within the body outside of the sessions when we touch those areas. And there's ways of growing those parts up, because IFS is sort of a parts type of psychotherapy. It's looking at different parts of the body. And then those parts are always very, very young parts, often stuck in a place and time when we're sort of 6 or 7 years old, and actually being kind to those parts and teasing them out and growing them up. And doing that with patients is really, really powerful work. Because I'm using it as a tool in an integrated session with patients, it's very hard. I mean, my sessions are longer with patients, but even in my longer sessions, I can't do all the integrated medicine and do the IFS. So often I'm doing 5 or 10 minutes of IFS towards the end, or at a point that seems appropriate, and then saying to the patient, go and get a UK-based IFS practitioner to do the deeper dives with. Once they're doing it, I'll probably, for the most part, stop doing it in the session with the patients. But those relationships that patients are having, I'm finding that, I don't know about you, but 80% of the patients we treat, or 3/4 of the patients we treat, are women, right? Men often don't deal with their stuff till they're sort of on the floor, and there's also that toxic masculinity side of men with health, or, because you want to compete at everything mentally and physically and never say there's anything wrong with you. So I think there's an element of that with men, while they won't admit to not functioning properly. And the problem with a lot of relationships is that we know that 50% of marriages end in divorce, but from the women that I work with in clinic, 3 out of 4 of them is unhappy in their marriage, right? So what we're talking really possibly is around 80 to 90% of people, especially when there's kids involved, right? Because to keep the erotic alive in a relationship when it's mired in domesticity is very difficult, almost impossible, right? So I could say that 80 to 90% of marriages are not are not that happy, right? And a lot of the time it's because people haven't done the work on themselves individually and as a couple to recognize old patterns. I think it was Krishnamurti, the great Indian sage, that said the real growth, something along the lines of real growth as an individual is done through relationship. And learning and growth is done through relationship. And I think that's doing that work together. I think it was Ramdas that said, there's three people in a relationship, you, me, and shared awareness. But you've got to get to that point of shared awareness. But another problem in relationships is that there's four people normally in a relationship. There's you, there's me, there's who I think you are, and there's who you think I am. And those are stories. They're not true, right? I'm trying to think what Gabor Mate calls it. He calls it I'll have to come back to that. I can't remember what he calls it. But it's saying the same thing in a slightly different way.
Right.
Working theory, that's it, working theory. So I have working theory about you and you have a working theory about me. But
Okay.
the working theory is completely outdated and it's totally incorrect, right? So I think a lot of these women that I see in my practice, I'm not saying it's the men are always at fault, but I'm saying a large chunk of the time the men aren't showing up for women. I'm willing to do couples therapy. And I always say, look, do couples therapy when things are good, not when it's bad, right? And the men aren't showing up. And men find it harder, right? I read in a book once that it can take a year or two for men to get the emotional depth in therapy that it takes women a couple of months. I think they're wired different in some ways. And I think the men are letting the women down. And I think that often they won't do couples therapy or they won't let the women in. But I think it's important this happens because I think if our patients aren't having good relationships in their life, and don't get me wrong, you can do your own individual therapy, but if they're in a relationship with someone and that other person is unwilling or they're not encouraging their partner to do that with them, then their own health, whether it's chronic fatigue or hormonal irregularities or whatever it might be, is not going to shift. I mean, I had a patient this week who, with working with her from the start, I said, you really need to do couples therapy. And she said, my husband's unwilling to do it. And we've been working together for a while now. And I said to her in this session, and we sat there in the session and we basically just did IFS for half an hour because I felt that's what she really needed this week. And she was very, very stressed. I was getting to go into her body, seeing where she felt the discomfort and talk to it and talk to that part. And I think she said she felt rushed and she felt frantic and all these different things. And I said to her intuitively, I really feel you need to have these conversations with your husband and try to get him to go to couples therapy with you because I don't think you're going to get better. But often it goes back to that place of, what's that saying? We accept the love we think we deserve, right? And again, that still comes back to childhood or lack of childhood bonding experiences. Yeah. So I do think there's a big overlap between the relationships we have in our lives and the physical symptoms that that people are experiencing. And I think it was David Rico, the American psychotherapist, that said it's good to have really good to have the 5 A's in a relationship, which are attention, affection, allowance, acceptance, and appreciation. We all need that, right?
Yeah.
I guess we don't always have that, in abundance, all 5 A's at once. But certainly, if you've got 3 or 4 of them, that's great.
Yeah.
Yes. Conversely, if you look at the Gottman's research, they have at the other end of the scale is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which they call defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and I can't remember the fourth. Criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Yeah. So if your relationship has a couple of those or more, they say that's the death knell of a relationship.
Okay.
So I think going back to the 5 A's, I think it's trying to cultivate those. But also I think that I still think it comes also then back to cultivating those things for ourselves, right? Not pushing that onto the other. It's great to appreciate each other, right? But can we appreciate ourselves? Can we have affection for ourselves? Can we allow and can we accept ourselves? And I think once we can have I don't think Rico mentions this in his book. He might be, maybe he doesn't, but once we can have those 5 for ourselves, it's much easier to have those for other people. Or go back to self-love. It's easy to love someone else when you can love yourself, right? And I think 90% of our patients, there isn't that element of self-love, right? So, and I think it's like, I don't know if I don't know if I've told you, I think I told you this, but I'm doing a 2-year training in couples therapy, which I've decided to do.
Oh, brilliant.
And I'll be doing, I'm very passionate about that now, as you can see. And I've seen the benefits and the power of it. And the guy's course I'm doing is Terry Real. And he has a quote that all relationships are a constant dance of harmony, disharmony, and repair. And that's true, right? So if a couple doesn't argue, there's something wrong, right? And often that comes back to attachment styles. You know, you have the avoidant, you have the secure, you have the anxious attached, right?
Yeah.
And when we're out of balance, we all drop into one of either anxious, avoidant, or there's an aberration called the disorganized attached, which is more rarer. Disorganized attached is like, I love you, piss off. You know, that's sort of the disorganized attached. I want you, go away, you know. But most couples are in the cachet of one person being anxious, one person being avoidant. That's quite common. You can have 2 avoidants as well. I myself was in a marriage where both types were avoidant. When we're out of balance, myself and my ex-wife are both avoidants. But the anxious, and I'm probably in a relationship now where I'm in a combination of anxious and avoidant, yeah, with my current partner. And that's normal. We all have them, right?
Yeah.
But it's sort of recognizing those and the conflicts. Like Terry Real says, no one teaches you to be in a relationship. You don't. The only reference point you have as a relationship is your parents' relationship, which in most cases is pretty dire, right? They didn't have the tools that we have now, like therapy and even having these podcasts that you and I are chatting about, right? And the awareness of that. And a therapist was seen as, like, I mentioned to my uncle this week, I have a therapist, and he was like, "Why are you doing that? There's nothing wrong with you. You don't need that." You know, it's seen as a terrible failure, right? But I think that what Terry says is that I can teach you. I can teach you how to relate. I can teach you how to be in a relationship. I can teach you how to have conflict, healthy anger, coming everything from love. And I know this may sound very depressing, but the Gottmans, who have done more research than anyone in the world on couples and relationship, I think they've now done 60,000 couples through their lab and for their research papers. They have now said in their latest book, which is How to Fight, which is brilliant, by the way, they've now said that in their lab, in a 3-minute argument, they can tell whether couples will be together in 6 years' time. And what a lot of the stuff comes back to in their research is that in an argument, and I know this is the depressing bit and the crazy bit, in an argument, you need a 5-to-1 ratio of positive things, interactions with you and your partner to negative. And then to the audience here, that's going to sound insane, because when you're flooded, how are you going to go, "I love you, darling," and try and reach out and grab your hand or whatever it might be, or reach out when you're both like, "Ah," you know, it's like, how would you have that positive to negative interaction? And I think you know, that's something you have to learn, right? And I think normally when one partner gets flooded, you know, and it's just you can't get through to them, it's often the other partner who has to do the repair and the reaching out, let's say. Often I think in my relationship, I think does tend to be, because of our attachment style, I think it does tend to be more me that reaches out. But simple techniques can be things like, "Hey, darling, you know, can we take a breath together? Take a couple of breaths. Will you hold my hand?" But depending how flooded someone is, might all go, "No, go away, don't hold your hand." You know? But it's so that, you know, it's or, you know, or if you both need the space, or you recognize that one is flooded, it's like, well, hey, I love you. Can we take 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 2 hours, whatever it might be? Always preface it by I love you. And when you go away and you take a breather, you don't go and ruminate on what you've argued about. You take a breather, you meditate, you walk a dog, whatever, I don't know, play Sudoku, I don't know. And then come back again and you say, are you ready to, can we try again? And
Yeah.
you might need more time. You might say, actually, you know what, I need another 2 hours. So there's different, and in the Gottman's book, they go through the possible things you can do in those situations about relating. And then what they also say with conflict is perpetual conflict is a conflict that most couples will have, which is around a conflict that comes up again and again over time. Yeah, a subject, let's say, you know.
Mm.
I mean, it will be something major. It won't be like who's taking the trash out. It'll be something more bigger than, And what they say is what underlies that always is a dream. And it's looking and trying to get to the dreams that underline the conflict. So it might be someone wants to go and retire on a sunny island somewhere, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah.
And getting to the dream is really important. And I think talking about repair, like Terry Reals' quote about the dance of harmony, disharmony, and repair, there's lots of different things you can do in those situations, but he quotes in his book, and it's not his words, it's someone else's words, that you can come back to a situation, you can say, hey, darling, or hey, my dear, or whatever. Oh, I felt X. This is what I heard. I felt X or Y. This is what I made up about it. And this is what will make me feel better. So
Yeah.
those steps, because in those situations, we always make up something about the situation. And then you come back to that working theory of that person. And then what can happen in these situations is there's an aberration of the working theory, which is you have this worst possible image of that partner you possibly have. So if you had to think about your partner, let's say, when she's at her absolute worst, you times that by 10, and you all have a version of that in your head. She's this and she's that, and we all do it, right? So that working theory gets massively inflated, and then we make up stuff. And then when we go into the repair, we can bring that, and that's quite powerful. And I think also reflecting back is always a good one. What I heard was, or what I'm hearing is, or that
Yeah.
sort of repeating back, or it's a bit like the imago dialogue, if you've heard of imago therapy. You say,
No.
what I'm hearing is created by Harville Hendricks. What I'm hearing is this. Have I got it right? Is there more? It's that type of, it's similar lines around like non-violent communication as well. A lot of
Yeah.
these things do overlap, I suppose.
Well, I
So
said what I'm hearing, Oliver, and I guess what I was gonna say is it feels like we're really talking about communication and our ability to do so in a gentle, compassionate, clear way. And if we can improve upon that within the relationship, then that feels like it's almost step one to having that depth within the relationship.
yeah, and I think it's about one of the writers in this field says that one of his books, the two take-home things for me was that, when you're communicating, you should go with what he calls the microscopic truth and how you're feeling. And bringing in all, even no matter how small it is, bringing that truth into the relationship, and also saying, this is what I'm feeling. And I think men do find that harder. And I think, if you can bring that into your relationships, because it's so hard to make relationships work with young kids or teenage kids or whatever it might be, then you've got, not to say obviously that some of our patients are kids have left the home and they're still unwell, right? I'm just saying that a lot of people I work with are unhappy in their marriages, and that would be a major cause of their chronic health problems, right? They'll come into the clinic with fatigue and pain, but a lot of that pain can be in relation, physical pain can be in relation to their relationship, which isn't great. And unless people do the work around for both of them, understanding the childhood wounds, and like it it's incredibly important that people do that. And I think what I'm also seeing is, again, on the same subject. I mean, I had a guy in a couple of weeks ago who was honestly, who suffered with such neglect as a child, like I cannot tell you. And then what did many people become when they have terrible childhoods, is they become the people pleaser. The idea that if I'm kind and nice to people, I won't suffer and I won't feel pain. They won't get angry with me and I won't suffer loss and abandonment. So it still comes back to the attachment versus
Mm.
authenticity thing I was talking about, silencing of the true self. And this poor guy, I felt so sorry for him. And he was in his 50s, and his dad used to take him out at 9 years old into London, forced beers down him on the train. The son would be, legless by the time they got into London. Then they go to the pub, and this is a 9-year-old boy getting a 9-year-old drunk. And the father was using it as a toxic bid for connection to make a man out of his son or whatever. That's just one thing out of many that happened to this guy as a kid,
Mm.
and really, really sad, and and I said to this guy, this is the stuff we need to look at. Really need to get you help here. And obviously he's coming in with the more traditional symptoms of fatigue, like chronic fatigue, and he's had workaholism as well. And a lot of, especially with the men, you do see this with the women as well. But I think with the men, you do see quite a lot of overwork, burnout, workaholism, the A-type personality. I
Yeah.
think I think that's what people tend to do, is they will numb quite, which is quite a normal response for most people, is that we'll numb pain, and we'll numb the stuff that is painful for us, and workaholism is a very socially acceptable form of addiction, right? And people will do this, and obviously the more obvious addictions obviously are things like drugs and alcohol, but workaholism is quite big. And the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The pattern is still the same, right? And again, sorry to sound like a bit of a Gabor Mate sort of obsessive, but again, Gabor Mate says, I think the way he describes things is very elegant. He says that, you shouldn't be asking why the addiction, you should be asking why the pain. And trauma isn't what happened to you, it's the wound it left in the body, right?
Mm.
And that's why we need to care for these wounds and move it through the body and grow those parts up and care for them tenderly, right? So when people have got, say, workaholism, there's a whole load of pain, right? I have a friend of mine who's a friend of a friend of mine's wife, and they the partner, she's had a whole load of childhood issues, and it's always numbed everything with alcohol, workaholism, and drugs, right? And that is, I mean, in many ways that's normal in society. It's not just the obvious things that people do. We'll do things like social media, scrolling, phones.
Yeah.
That's another one, right? The constant looking at the phone, right? Or numbing an emotion as soon as it comes up with a bit of screen time. Let's say. I think that's maybe the new addiction or the newer addiction, right? And I think what I was mentioning at the beginning about noticing things in the body, what I say to patients is, you can perhaps a little exercise you can do when you go home or day to day is doing a bit of self-inquiry and saying, hey, how am I doing today? How am I feeling? What's going on for me in the body? What do I notice in this moment? And trying to get in touch with what's there. Because, like when I came on the call with you today, I was thinking, how do I feel? And I've had a bit of a rough week this week. I've had a very sort of intense session with my own therapist this week, and doing couples therapy, and things are good. I do couples therapy when things are good to deepen our relationships. I use it as a tool for more and more depth with my partner, but it doesn't mean that the sessions are still bloody painful. They're really hard, right? So it's been a harder week, but then I still, at the beginning of the session, was just checking in with myself. How am I doing and how am I feeling in starting the session with you? And I noticed there was little bit of, and I've done this like you dozens of times, but there's still a bit of apprehension, a little bit of nervousness, a little bit of tenseness in the body. And I think, oh, tenseness, nervousness. Or like Ramdas said, oh, so, it's like, oh, okay. And I said to myself, and I said to my head, can you welcome that, Oliver? I asked myself, can you welcome that? And I'm like, yeah, I can. And I did this all in my head as we were starting. And that's why I said to you, hey, maybe come back to this in a bit. But I think with our patients, if we can get the patients just as a starting point, just to notice where things are in the body, or maybe when they come in for a consult, obviously this video presumably is viewed, is it viewed just by, presumably more by the public than it is by practitioners, or is it a bit of a mix?
Yeah, hard to say. I mean, it's not far off a 50-50, I would say, if I had to guess.
Okay. So I think if many practitioners since the pandemic are working online, I'm one of the few that still works face to face wherever I can, right? So it's easier to do these body-based activities when you're having just got the Zoom down to here. It's nice if you can see the whole body, right? But you know, sometimes when a patient walks into the clinic, people can say, because well, being very British, we'll go, oh, how are you? How are you today? I go,
Yeah.
I'm good. How are you? Very rarely would people say, oh, I'm on a really, really shit day and da, 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 or whatever it might be, right? It's always, yes, jolly good. How are you? But I think if you can get people to sit down and just say, right, how are you doing? What are you feeling in the body? And obviously, you can do that at the beginning of a session, the middle or an end, but obviously at the beginning, people might be feeling a bit more tense or apprehensive. They've got to spill their guts to you, right? So maybe it's better to do towards as you sort of soften them up a bit. But it's a really good exercise to do maybe when people are touching a bit of pain, old pain in a consult with them, and say, hey, so I'll often say, because sometimes I'll be with a patient and I'll say, oh, I'm going to refer you for IFS. And we'll get to a point in the consult and I'll actually, no, let's do this now. And that's happened a couple of times to me in the last few weeks with a patient. I'm like, right, this is live. Let's do it. And what are you feeling in the body? Where is this? And it's a very simple exercise, and often very, very powerful, to do with patients. And sometimes you can see what a very simple exercise can be. What are you feeling in the body? Where do you feel it? How do you feel towards that part? Is there anything that part would like to say? I've had it in a session with a patient recently, and she's gone, oh, that part's really angry. A bit of my body, it feels angry. And I go, oh, why is it angry? And she said, oh, I'm really angry with my parents, or whatever the person might have said. So it's a pretty cool, simple technique that anyone can do, whether a practitioner or not. Doesn't matter if you're IFS qualified or not. It really doesn't. It's a very, very simple exercise. So I think that, I think that some of these, I think a lot, I mean, again, this is a bit, I'm probably shooting myself in the foot here a little bit, but or both of us maybe, but, I think that a lot of our patients could really actually go and do, rather than coming to see us, right, could actually go and work with an IFS practitioner or someone doing compassionate inquiry and probably get completely better about going and see anyone doing functional medicine. I think a lot of the time, I've even had patients didn't fancy doing I call it the physical medicine, the supplements and the herbs and the dietary stuff. I call it physical medicine. And I've had some patients who didn't fancy doing that and have just gone and done Primal Trust, which you might have heard of. Primal Trust is a bit of a next generation brain retraining, incorporates the brain retraining that DNRS has, but incorporates a lot more to it. So it's got a lot of the polyvagal stuff, trauma work. It's very supported, so you can jump on multiple calls a day. You can be part of a Signal or a WhatsApp group with people in the same predicament as you. And I've had patients who've just done Primal Trust and get completely better from chronic illness with doing nothing else whatsoever. I've had a couple of really bad mold toxicity cases who've just done that. I like to do both. I like to do the physical with the mental, emotional, spiritual work, because I find that really gives the breadth and the depth that patients need.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a lot of, because of the sort of the medical paradigm we're in, people want like a pill for an ill, to change something, change a diet, take a different supplement, take a different herb, do another test, or, I think that's the sort of the medical paradigm we're in, right? And I think, I don't know about you, but I think as naturopaths, we always talking about the gut and, autoimmunity and gut immunity and intestinal permeability. And someone comes in with rheumatoid arthritis and you're trying to tell a patient that, oh, your pain in your knee, it's to do with your gut, you know, and it's been, there's a lot of stuff out there now, but it's still been a bit of an education for people over the last 10 years, and there's so much more awareness around it. But now, I think it's even harder now, because patients coming in now, yes, there's more awareness around trauma, but you say to a patient, that pain in your knee and why you're feeling so tired, it's because of the way your early bonding experience of your mum. I think that's a much bigger leap than, I think it's a much bigger leap than saying pain in your knee is because of your microbiome or lack of decent diversity or whatever, you know. And it's
Yeah, I think that word around education, I think, is such an important one, because I find myself more and more that's what I'm sort of doing with clients. It's kind of giving people the context and giving them the capacity, ability, understanding that we need to take that really, really broad and holistic understanding that everything is interconnected. And I don't know about you, Oliver, but some of the things that you touched on there, I guess in my own journey over the last 3, 4 years, I've kind of ebbed and flowed with this one of my sort of susceptibilities is towards black and white thinking still. So I ebb and flow between, it's all trauma, everyone just needs nervous system regulatory stuff. And the supplements just aren't going to cut it. When in reality, they're not separate entities, and they are completely and utterly interconnected still. It's just what's going to move the needle the most for that client. So that educational piece, I think, is everything.
Yeah, and I think it may be that, I do believe very much in the law of attraction in the terms of, many things in life. And I think the patients we attract them for a reason, right? So I had a very traumatic childhood, right? And why am I running a clinic that specializes in complex illness and treating incredibly traumatized people? Well, it's got to be partly to do with my background, right? Because clinicians have joined my clinic from other clinics where they were treating the same type of patients, supposedly, and have had to leave because they found it too upsetting working with the type of patients that we see, right? Because of their backgrounds. So I think to myself, well, not everyone is seeing those patients, right? Like if you're a lady and because many people, don't they, in our field get into this field because of their own health journeys, right? And if you're someone who's a lady or practitioner who specializes, I don't know, in PCOS, you'll probably attract a lot of PCOS cases, right? Or hormone irregularities or endometriosis or whatever it might be. So not everyone is treating the super complex cases. I'm speaking obviously to my experience with having treated over 20,000 patients now, my experience has been that with the complex cases, the autoimmunities, the mast cell stuff, Lyme disease, chronic fatigue, all those types of conditions, I can only say what I find, and I find that those patients there's a lot of issues around inherited and developmental trauma. And I'm not the only one that's noticed that. Obviously, lots of colleagues in the States have. Obviously, Peter Levine, Gabor Mate has been championing that for a while in his book, When the Body Says No, around autoimmunity, and in his new book. So I agree with you. It's not, I think people can get better just by doing the emotional trauma type work. I do like to combine the two. I think the testing, I think the testing is often for the benefit of the patient rather than the clinician, to feel vindicated. And I mean, I could talk for an hour about the vagaries of Lyme testing, and I won't go into that. But I think it's a quote often attributed to Einstein that not everything that can be counted, not everything that can be counted counts. And we can't test for everything, right? And for example, I had a patient set of results come in yesterday, right? And it just so happened that the we measured magnesium in 3 different ways, right? Just this is probably the first I've ever done it like this, just purely by chance. And we done serum magnesium, red blood cell magnesium, and plasma magnesium, right? I'd have to check in the Lord book, but I was under the impression that red blood cell magnesium was the best way of measuring it, right? And I guess they each have their pros and cons, right? On the face of it, the serum magnesium, which I know is not the best way of measuring magnesium, looked average to okay. Red blood cell magnesium looked pretty damn good, right? Plasma magnesium looked not so great. So I'm thinking to myself, bloody hell, does the patient need magnesium? you know, and I think like, oh, not so sure. I don't know what. I said, well, you know what? Magnesium is involved with so many processes in the body. It's like, well, it's not going to hurt to give them some magnesium, right? But I think, that was just a live example. But I think the testing is, as a whole, is only so useful. And often it's a snapshot in time. I even have some patients where we look at blood chemistry and some labs measure just the red blood cells, even though we're looking at pathogens, let's say. And I can do a blood chemistry panel with a lab in England and then a pathogen panel of a lab in Germany. And the red blood cells will be 20% difference on one of the set of results. So the same blood on the same day.
Mm.
So, and I think like with stool testing as well, I think there is, again, it's a snapshot in time. I think, we know that, it's only to look at what's going on, let's say, in that moment. So I think that, I'm not sure how I came on to testing, but I think that, I don't know where I came to the testing from, but I think that patients are interested in testing. That's why I thought I'd come on to it. And I think that
Yeah.
they do want, there's a lot of that sort of, oh, I know where I was going with this. It was around patients saying, well, my magnesium looks fine, or my B12 looks fine. But I think if we're trying to educate patients around orthomolecular medicine, that it's good to use therapeutic doses, even when their results are normal. And that's in education as well. I find that sometimes a difficult one to get, because we're so used to this paradigm of we run a test, oh, the test is normal, everything's fine, to
Mm.
try and explain to a patient, hey, your B12 is absolutely fine in your, set of results, but hey, I want to give you shitloads of B12 because it's going to do A, B, C, and D. And some patients really struggle with that, They say,
Yeah.
but my results are normal. And then you have to explain to them the differences between RDAs, which are really dumb amounts, optimal doses and therapeutic doses.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is a lot of education. And then going back to what you said about, that sort of, black or white, what you were saying. And I don't know if I think I recommended it to you. I don't know if you read it, that book, The Expectation Effect.
No, not yet.
Haven't got around to it. Well, that'll blow your mind, that book. There is that expectation effect with working with patients all the time, where it's placebo or nocebo.
Mm.
Um, and I think the most powerful tool we have with patients is ourselves. And if they believe in us and then believe in themselves, then I think they will get better regardless of what technique they do. I still believe that they have to touch the pain, the wounds, they have to go to those places. But if they have a very firm belief in you as a practitioner helping them, and there is that trust and connection, the prescription I don't think is so relevant.
Yeah. And you mentioned stories earlier, and I think, that's a really key part here. And a lot of what you've talked about today reminds me, and we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, I think the concept of narrative medicine, sort of understanding the client story of their experience, asking them what X means for them. And I think we can be in a conventional medicine model, it's often what the doctor thinks. The doctor's narrative kind of leads the relationship. And in narrative medicine, the client story leads sort of the relationship in regards to feeling understood, feeling heard, being validated that they have these symptoms. It's such, as you say, a therapeutic part of that process. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the part of the problem is, I think that look, obviously conventional medical practitioners have less time with their patients, right?
Mm.
Um, but I think there's a sense, and obviously they're seeing such horrors, like, losing patients, the patients dying, people severely ill in hospital. But I think the problem with the way they often these guys approach this, the specialists, a lot of the time the patients are just seen as, especially with surgeons, like it's a lot in some ways to be a bit crude, like a lump of meat, let's say. You're performing surgery, you're cutting something out, you're doing this, and it becomes a bit of you become, I think a lot of these specialists become um in a way they disassociate themselves from what's in front of them to protect them from the pain, right? Because
Yeah.
if they kept their hearts open to what was there, the interaction between the patient and the physician could really be so much deeper, right? But because it's so painful to constantly keep our hearts open to those patients, um, understandably, most people within conventional medicine, and also, within integrated as well, will remain a little bit distant, um, and guarded, let's say. And I think as clinicians ourselves, I think you were talking about this off recording earlier, and maybe you can elaborate the language you used around it, but around compassion. What was the phrase? Compassion.
Compassion fatigue and compassion
Yeah,
resilience.
compassion fatigue. I get that. So there is a balance, right? Because if you're a clinician, and I'm very I have a lot of compassion for my patients. I'm always keeping my heart open and trying to go to them with them to their pain and help them hold that pain, right? But there does come a point where you get too open, perhaps. And there are occasions, we're only human. Like I said to you earlier, I sometimes have patients, they walk out the door and I sit there and I sob, right? Because it's touched something with me, and there is that compassion, but also when it's touching that thing with me, there's my own pain and my own grief, my own sadness from my own stuff it touches into, right? Um, so it's finding a balance, right? But I think in conventional medicine, it's right at the other end. And if physicians in conventional medicine could meet patients with their pain together and be with them in that moment with that, um, there would be a lot more better results, I think, for patients, and would serve, would serve the patients and society as a whole a lot better. But it is finding that balance, isn't it, between, because I think if you're sort of too open, then you suffer as a clinician yourself, I think. So it's having
Oh,
some boundary, some boundary.
yes, exactly. And I think the theme of the paper was really around that, this idea that, we need to have healthy boundaries. We need to be taking care of ourselves so we can take care of our clients or patients ultimately. And again, I think this was off air that we spoke about it. It might have been during the podcast, but this idea that the more self-care we're doing and the deeper we're exploring ourselves and our wounds, the easier it is for us to go there with our clients. I've absolutely found that the more I'm practicing self-care, the easier it is for me to go to some of those places that I need to go with the client. And I can do that with more compassion, more curiosity, feeling more grounded and just able to go there. Whereas if I'm frazzled and burnt out or just going from one thing to the next, like there have been times where I've, to some degree, consciously, I guess, just what's the word? Well, essentially avoided going to a conversation that I felt was needed at that point in time because I wasn't grounded enough to go there. So yeah, I think it's so important that we have that resiliency, that we have that compassion resilience, if we're going to help our clients to the best of our ability.
Yeah, and I think also um, with that connection, I think that touching on a slightly different aspect of connection is that, I think one of the questions in our intake forms are you in touch with anything that's sort of greater than ourselves, let's say. Some
Mm.
people say yes, some people say no. Um, and I think there's more to expand on that, but I think it's helpful for patients in their healing journey to feel that they can be in touch with something greater than themselves, or an element of super consciousness, or you could call it God, or whatever you want to call it, right? Or the universe, in touch with aspects of the universe, or I think that's important. And I think, but also connection to the earth and the land. I think we've lost so much of that, and what we're doing to the environment and the planet, is pretty poor, what we've done as humans in the last 100 years, right? But can we get back to a place of connection, with some connection to the trees, the living world, and a sense of, maybe a sense of awe or wonder, but also then a connection to maybe something that's a little bit greater than ourselves. And I think that can be helpful as well, I think, for patients on their journey. You can call it what you want, but it's funny. I remember there's a Ramdas sort of story that he tells sometimes, where I think it was a New York Times article, and they were looking at people and they were saying, who has had an experience, like an experience of super consciousness, or a realization there was something greater than themselves, and they had some experience that demonstrated that. And the survey was something like, I don't know, 70% of people had something like that. And out of that 70%, only 20% of the people surveyed ever wanted to experience anything like that ever again.
Really?
I just thought it was so funny, right? It's a funny story he tells it, because it is a funny story, right? And it's interesting that people have these experiences but find it too overwhelming.
Well,
It
yeah,
shakes your foundations, right?
it
Just
does shake the foundations. It can be destabilizing, and I think my thought on it is, so many of us are stuck in such a hamster wheel of living at such pace, with so many responsibilities, trying to get to the end of the month to pay our bills and ensure that we can do that there's just such polar opposites in our day-to-day lives compared to those profound experiences that we can have through different sort of avenues. And I think that might be one of the reasons why so many people didn't want to have the experience again.
Yeah, and it can be overwhelming. I mean,
Yeah.
I won't go into the detail now, but you might remember I had this insane spiritual awakening over 10 years ago, which lasted 3 months. And I thought I was going insane. I couldn't tell anyone about it. I only told 2 people at the time, and I literally thought I was going crazy, And it lasted 3 months. It wasn't some one-off experience, and I thought I was literally going mad. So, in the West, people have those sort of experiences, they are locked up and put in mental asylums. If it happens in India, you're put in the temple and said you're God intoxicated. That's what happened to what's her name, Andamai Ma, one of the great Indian saints.
Okay.
He was literally going through all this crazy awakening and Kundalini rising for long, long periods of time. And they took her into a temple, and she spent like a year or so in a temple, and then she became one of the greatest Indian sages of all time. So it's looked on slightly differently in the East.
Yeah, and I think Jules Evans, I mean, he's got a book. What's his book called? I read it a long time ago, but he talks about this essentially. We don't have containers in the West to have those peak experiences ultimately, or certainly not many. And we might be getting it a little bit now from music and dance, or for some sports, you can get it through psychedelics, obviously, and breath work. But it's not part of our culture or society anymore, these peak experiences. And I think it's a really powerful book. So if people aren't aware of Jules Evans, he's got 2 or 3 brilliant books on these sorts of things.
I'll look that up. You have to send me later to remind me.
Yeah, it's a very good book, and each chapter is on a different way of experiencing peak
Oh,
experiences, and like
that's
he
cool.
he went and explored each of them, and shares kind of his story with it as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'd love to read about that. And thinking about experiences, I was thinking about, rites of passage. It's
Mm,
another thing that's been lost, for
yeah.
men, women. There are people still doing it. So women, there's Jill Kettle and her work called something called
Okay.
her daughter's work that she does. And you go and tend a fire, and there's a central fire, and there's like you tend your own fire at night on your own when you're like 13, 14-year-old girl, and really interesting work that she does. And there are some work for boys as well. There's and some work for younger men. but people used to have shared labor, shared toil with their fathers and stuff. And there's been a big loss in the West of rites of passage and shared toil, shared labor, shared experiences. And I think a lot of that's been lost on our children, and I think that I think is important as well.
Yeah, there's a lot that we just need to sort of bring back ultimately.
Yeah, or elders, and having elders, literally
Yeah.
having, that sense of being an elder and someone you can go and talk to, or having a role
Mm,
model for children. It doesn't have to be someone actually necessarily within the family. I think that can be really useful as well.
mm.
Um, so yeah, we've just got it's like Gabor Mate's book, his latest one, The Myth of Normal. And it's like society, like he says, the society is rigged. It's like it's rigged for, I mean, that sounds depressing, but not for failure, but it's rigged for us to be the way we are, as we are at the moment. The system is rigged.
Yeah.
And we just got to see the system for what it is and find ways of sort of getting out of the system. Yeah, well, as in a connection back to earth, the living environment, like you
Mm.
said, breath work, whatever it might be, and just stopping, noticing, just getting back to basics. I mean, I'm off to a cabin in the woods tomorrow, for 3 nights. So talking about getting
Beautiful.
back to basics. So with my partner. So that's quite nice. Getting those like breaks, just back in nature, simplicity, let's say, can be useful like as a reset.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Whenever you get the opportunity, it doesn't have to be anything significant. I always say to my clients, look, I know I wear an Oura ring, and I know that if I go and spend a couple of hours in the park on a Saturday afternoon, the following day, my heart rate variability is sort of 10 points higher. And it just shows you that little things, if done consistently, can have a really big impact on some of these things.
Weren't you saying to me recently that you felt you've read some places recently saying if your HRV isn't high enough, you're not going to sort gut issues out?
Well, yeah, ultimately, that you need I kind of view it as a prerequisite to healing. You need
Yeah.
a well-regulated nervous system that is distributing its resources appropriately. So if you've got, put simply, I guess, a dysregulated nervous system, you're fighting an uphill battle from the beginning. So, you can do the diet and the supplements, but ultimately your foundations aren't there. So yeah, I think it's a nice lens into where do we need to start.
Where's what were you saying the number was for HRV? Did you say over 50, did you say?
Well, I know I've spoken to people on the podcast and just working with a few clients over the last year who are kind of keeping a close eye on their HRV. And certainly it seems like I know Elliot Overton said it was really when he got his HRV into the high 50s, 60s that his gut stuff just disappeared.
Interesting.
And
I'm just
obviously, I mean, there's a genetic component to it. So with the Aura ring, they'll say, look, people's HRV could be anything from high teens to 120. So, it's important to appreciate you're going to have a personal range, I guess, there as well.
What about age? Doesn't HRV drop as you get older?
Uh, I would have thought so, yes. To what degree, I guess, will depend on the quality of that aging.
Ah, and so I noticed yesterday my HRV for like my data for last night was quite good. I had a max of 80 and average of 48. So it's getting there, it's getting there.
Nice.
But it's the average that counts. Obviously, you want to know what the average is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, I think once you've got a couple of weeks of data, you've got your baseline data, and then it's a great way of monitoring the efficacy of a program ultimately as well, because you want to see it going in the right direction, and that might precede people feeling a difference. So again, you kind of know that you're on the right path, and actually a bit of patience and trusting the process and the plan is going to be important. Or people feel worse, but HRV is improving, meaning that again, you're doing the right thing. You just need to process what's going on. So if people are moving out of a freeze state, they might experience a heightened level of anxiety or some distress because
Mm,
actually they're mobilizing stuff. So again, I think it's a really powerful way to help people understand what's going on.
mm, yeah. Yeah. I read a quote this week. It's been on my mind. It's funny, it's a very subtle quote. I mean, on the face of it, it doesn't look like very much, but for me, it has a lot of depth if you look at it. The quote is, remember it now. Everything we do to satisfy a need.
Mm.
It's quite frightening in many ways, and many people might just gloss over that quote. But for me, I like to think about things, and it's a powerful quote, that, and you can look at it and you can use it, you can meditate on it, and it is pretty frightening. If you think that everything we do is to satisfy a need, the good things, the bad, whatever we do, and it's true. If you think about it.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, have a have a long think about that one, and
Yeah,
maybe that might be a useful point to conclude things.
I think so, Oliver. I can hear Barnaby crying away in the background, so I
Oh,
think
okay.
I need to go and play dad for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Um,
I might like to ask you something off air actually afterwards if you hang about. So some quickly
okay,
answer.
yeah, of
So,
course.
yeah,
Yeah, not a problem.
yeah,
Oliver, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and your experience and your journey and what's going on for you. I think it's a really important area of health that doesn't get talked about as much as it should in sort of the
yeah.
functional medicine space. So I'm really looking forward to sharing it.
And we need to get practitioners down to November, our workshop.
Yes,
Which is
yeah,
perfect.
maybe I'll add that to the intro.
Yeah, cool, cool.
Perfect. Oliver, until next time,
All
thank
right.
you.
Cheers.